The bridge of the Crimson Talon hummed with activity as Commander Vexthor reviewed the data streaming across his display.
His long, scaled fingers moved across the control panel with practiced ease.
Behind him, his crew worked at their stations, monitoring the vast emptiness of space. The Zalthar Empire had sent his warship to investigate unusual radio signals coming from a small blue planet in an unremarkable star system. Vexthor studied the information with growing amusement. The planet was called Earth, and it was home to a species that called themselves humans. The commander's lipless mouth curved into what passed for a smile among his kind. These creatures were still using primitive chemical rockets to barely escape their own gravity well. Their most advanced weapons were nuclear bombs that could destroy cities but would barely scratch the shields of a single Imperial scout ship. The communications officer turned toward Vexthor with a strange expression on his face. He had been listening to human broadcasts for the past several hours. The officer explained that humans spent most of their time fighting each other over trivial matters, like invisible lines on maps and ancient religious texts. They had dozens of separate governments that could barely agree on anything. Their planet was warming because they burned fossil fuels for energy, a technology the Empire had abandoned thousands of years ago. Vexthor laughed, a sound like grinding stones. This would be the easiest conquest in Imperial history. The Empire had absorbed 300 star systems over the past 5 centuries. Each time the process was the same. The Imperial fleet would arrive, demonstrate their superior power, and the local species would surrender. Most civilizations were smart enough to recognize when they were completely outmatched. He ordered his crew to prepare a standard first contact message. The communication would be broadcast on all human frequencies. It would explain that Earth now fell under Imperial jurisdiction. The humans would have 7 standard cycles, roughly equal to 7 of their days to formally surrender. If they refused, the Empire would demonstrate its military superiority. After that demonstration, surrender would no longer be an option. The message was transmitted. Vexthor settled back in his command chair to wait for the inevitable response. He expected the humans to panic, to argue among themselves, and then to submit. It was the pattern every species followed. Fear was universal, and survival instinct always won in the end. Meanwhile, on Earth, the message reached every television, radio, and computer screen simultaneously. In a military command center buried beneath the mountains of Colorado, Captain Jake Morrison watched the alien transmission with a mixture of shock and concern. The alien's translator made its words perfectly clear. Surrender or die. Simple as that. Jake was a career military officer who had spent 20 years in the United Earth Defense Force. The UEDF had been created 5 years earlier when humanity first detected signs of intelligent life beyond their solar system. Most people had thought it was a waste of money. Now, as Jake looked at the arrogant alien on his screen, he was grateful for every ship and weapon they had built. Lieutenant Claire Bennett stood beside him, her face pale but determined. She was one of the best tactical officers in the fleet, known for her ability to think creatively under pressure. Claire had studied military history extensively, particularly battles where smaller forces defeated larger ones through clever strategy and unconventional tactics. The world leaders met in emergency session. Some argued for immediate surrender. They pointed out the obvious fact that humanity had no chance against a civilization that could cross interstellar space. Others argued for resistance, saying that submission to an alien empire was unacceptable, regardless of the odds. The debate raged for 6 days. On the 7th day, Jake and Claire were called to present Earth's response to the alien delegation. Jake stood in front of the camera wearing his full dress uniform. His words were simple and direct. He thanked the Zalthar Empire for their message. He explained that humanity had considered their offer carefully. Then he delivered Earth's answer. No, humanity would not surrender. Earth would remain independent. If the Empire wanted to take their planet, they would have to fight for every inch of it. The message ended with Jake stating calmly that humanity looked forward to teaching the Empire why they should have chosen a different star system to invade. The transmission reached the Crimson Talon within minutes. Vexthor watched it with his entire bridge crew gathered around. When Jake finished speaking, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the entire bridge erupted in laughter. The sound echoed through the ship's corridors. Several officers actually fell from their chairs, overcome with mirth at the absurdity of what they had just witnessed. Vexthor wiped tears from his eyes. These humans were either insane or incredibly stupid, perhaps both. He immediately transmitted the recording to Admiral Krell, the supreme commander of the Imperial military. The Admiral needed to see this for himself. Admiral Krell watched the humans' defiant message from his flagship at the edge of Zalthar space. He was an ancient warrior who had conquered 50 worlds personally. He had seen every type of resistance imaginable. Guerrilla warfare, suicide attacks, desperate last stands, all of it. But he had never seen a species this outmatched declare war so confidently. Krell found it hilarious. He called his senior officers to his chambers and played the message for them. They laughed until their sides hurt. One officer joked that perhaps the humans thought their nuclear weapons would somehow penetrate Imperial shields. Another suggested that maybe humans didn't understand the concept of technology levels. A third proposed that humanity was simply too primitive to comprehend how badly they were about to lose. The Admiral made his decision. He would send a demonstration fleet to Earth's solar system, 50 warships, enough to obliterate any resistance but small enough to send a message, the message being that the Empire wasn't even taking this seriously. 50 ships represented less than 1% of Imperial military strength. It was an insult, deliberately calculated to break human morale. Admiral Krell expected the demonstration fleet to arrive, destroy a few human ships, and prompt immediate surrender. The entire operation would take less than 1 day. Then Earth would be absorbed into the Empire like every other conquered world. The humans would work in Imperial factories. Their resources would fuel Imperial expansion, and in a few generations, they would forget they had ever been independent. The Admiral's orders were transmitted across the Imperial fleet. Commander Vexthor received his instructions with satisfaction. He would lead the demonstration fleet personally. This was going to be entertaining. Maybe he would even keep one of the human ships intact as a trophy, something to show his offspring when he retired, a monument to the species that thought it could defy the Zalthar Empire. 50 Imperial warships gathered at the edge of human space. Their weapons could crack planets. Their shields could withstand sustained nuclear bombardment. Their engines could cross the distance from Earth's sun to Earth itself in mere hours. Against them, humanity had a few dozen ships built from repurposed satellites and space stations, armed with weapons that were primitive by galactic standards. On paper, it wasn't even a fight. The Empire would win. Everyone knew it. The Zalthar knew it. The other species in the galaxy knew it. Even most humans knew it. But as Commander Vexthor gave the order for his fleet to advance toward Earth, he had no idea that paper calculations meant nothing to a species that had never learned when to quit. The Imperial demonstration fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system. Commander Vexthor stood on the bridge of the Crimson Talon, watching as his 50 warships spread into a standard attack formation. Each ship was 3 times the size of the largest human vessel. Their weapons had been tested against every known form of defense. Their crews were professional soldiers who had trained for decades. Vexthor expected to see human ships fleeing toward their homeworld. Instead, his sensors detected movement in the opposite direction. 6 human vessels were accelerating toward his fleet. The commander checked his instruments twice, certain there must be an error. But no, the readings were correct. The humans were actually coming to fight. Lieutenant Claire Bennett sat in the command chair of the destroyer Vigilant. Around her, the small bridge crew worked at their stations with practiced efficiency. They had trained for this moment, though none of them had truly believed it would come. Claire's hands were steady on the controls despite the fear coursing through her veins. Behind her ship, 5 more human vessels maintained formation. The human fleet was pathetically small by Imperial standards. The Vigilant had been built in orbit around Earth just 3 years ago. It was constructed from steel and titanium, materials the Empire hadn't used for shipbuilding in centuries. Its weapons were railguns that fired solid metal projectiles using electromagnetic force. Primitive, simple, and according to every expert in the galaxy, completely useless against modern energy shields. Claire opened a channel to the other 5 ship commanders. She reminded them of the plan they had practiced endlessly during the 7 days since the Empire's ultimatum. The plan was insane, which made it perfect. The Zalthar fought according to rules that had evolved over centuries of warfare. They expected their enemies to follow similar rules. Humanity's advantage was that they didn't know the rules existed, so they couldn't break them. Commander Vexthor watched with amusement as the tiny human fleet approached. He gave the order to fire a warning shot. One of his cruisers activated its main plasma cannon. A beam of superheated energy lanced across the darkness of space, passing just ahead of the lead human ship. The shot was deliberately aimed to miss, intended to demonstrate Imperial firepower and prompt an immediate retreat. Instead, the human ship scattered in 6 different directions. Claire had anticipated the warning shot. The moment the enemy cruiser's weapon systems activated, she ordered evasive maneuvers. The 6 human ships broke formation, each one racing away at maximum acceleration. Their paths were random and chaotic, making it nearly impossible for the Imperial targeting computers to track them effectively. Vexthor frowned. This wasn't standard military procedure. When faced with superior force, the proper response was to maintain formation and retreat in an orderly fashion. Instead, these humans were flying like insects, darting and weaving without any apparent pattern. It was undisciplined, chaotic, and extremely annoying. He ordered his fleet to fire at will. 20 Imperial warships opened fire simultaneously. Plasma beams and energy pulses filled the space between the 2 fleets. The Imperial gunners were skilled and experienced, but they had never tried to hit targets that moved so unpredictably. Most of their shots missed. The few that connected struck human shields which flared and held. Barely. Claire pushed her ship through a spiraling turn that would have torn apart any civilian vessel. The Vigilance hull groaned under the stress, but it held together. Ahead of her, an Imperial cruiser loomed large. She armed her ship's main weapon, a railgun that ran nearly the entire length of her vessel. The weapon was engineer Danny Wells's masterpiece, designed based on a simple principle. If energy weapons couldn't penetrate Imperial shields, try something with mass. She fired. The railgun sent a solid tungsten projectile downrange at a significant fraction of light speed. The round was essentially a metal telephone pole accelerated to unimaginable velocity. It struck the Imperial cruiser's shields with devastating force. The shields, designed to deflect and absorb energy, tried to stop a solid object traveling at relativistic speed. Physics 1. The projectile punched through the shield like it wasn't there. It struck the cruiser's hull, penetrating deep into the ship's interior before its kinetic energy finally dissipated. The cruiser shuddered, systems failing across multiple decks. Atmosphere vented from the breach. The ship was still functional, but it was hurt. On the Crimson Talon's bridge, every crew member stared at their displays in shock. Commander Vexthor couldn't believe what he was seeing. A primitive kinetic weapon had just damaged an Imperial warship. It shouldn't have been possible. The shield technology the Empire used had stopped. Every weapon thrown at it for 300 years. But the Zalthar had fought energy-based warfare for so long that they had forgotten that shields worked differently against solid matter. Their defensive systems were optimized for plasma, lasers, and particle beams. A chunk of metal moving fast enough was something their shields simply weren't designed to handle efficiently. The other 5 human ships pressed their attack. They moved in ways that violated every rule of proper military formation. One ship dove below the plane of battle. Another looped up and over. A third accelerated directly toward an Imperial destroyer, firing continuously. The Zalthar crews tried to respond, but they kept expecting the humans to behave rationally, to follow some kind of tactical doctrine. The humans didn't. Danny Wells watched the battle from the Vigilance engineering section. He had spent the past 7 days modifying every weapon system on every human ship. The railguns were his idea, based on technology that was over a century old. The Empire had moved past kinetic weapons long ago, considering them crude and inefficient. Danny had proved that crude could be effective. 2 more Imperial ships took damage from railgun strikes. One lost its primary sensor array. Another suffered engine damage that left it limping. The human ships weren't winning exactly, but they weren't losing as quickly as they should have been. Every minute they survived was a minute the Empire hadn't expected them to have. Commander Vexthor made a decision he had never thought he would make. He ordered his fleet to withdraw. Not a retreat, he told himself, just a tactical reposition to reassess the situation. The 50 Imperial warships pulled back, opening distance between themselves and the still darting human vessels. 3 of his ships had sustained damage. No Imperial vessels had been destroyed, but the fact that primitives had hurt them at all was unacceptable. Claire watched the Imperial fleet withdraw and allowed herself a small smile. She had lost 1 ship in the engagement, a destroyer that had taken a direct hit from an Imperial plasma cannon. But 5 human ships had survived against 50 Imperial warships, They had scored hits. They had proven that the Empire could bleed. Vexthor compiled his report for Admiral Krell with hands that trembled slightly. He had to explain how a demonstration fleet had been forced to withdraw by 6 primitive vessels. He included all the tactical data, the recordings of the railgun impacts, the analysis of the human ship's erratic flight patterns. He concluded his report with a statement that felt like poison in his mouth. These humans were more dangerous than anticipated. Admiral Krell read the report aboard his flagship. His initial amusement had vanished, replaced by cold anger. The demonstration was supposed to break human morale. Instead, the humans would interpret the withdrawal as a victory. The other species in the galaxy would see that report and question Imperial invincibility. This situation had escalated from amusing to problematic. The Admiral sent new orders. 200 warships would advance on Earth immediately. This time there would be no demonstration, no warning shots, no restraint. The fleet would eliminate all human military capability and occupy the planet. The Empire's reputation required a swift and decisive victory. Back on Earth, Jake Morrison watched footage of the battle and felt both pride and dread. Pride because his people had fought brilliantly. Dread because he knew the Empire would respond with overwhelming force. The first battle had been a tactical success but changed nothing strategically. Humanity was still hopelessly outmatched. The Empire could field thousands of ships. Earth had fewer than 50 combat-capable vessels remaining. Claire landed her damaged ship at the lunar base where the human fleet was regrouping. As she walked through the corridors, other pilots and crew members stopped to congratulate her. She accepted their thanks with a nod, but her mind was already working on the next problem. They had surprised the Empire once. It wouldn't happen again. The Zalthar would adapt, and when they returned, they would be ready for railguns and chaotic flight patterns. That night, Jake, Claire, and Danny met in a secure conference room. They reviewed every second of the battle, looking for any advantage they could exploit. The Empire was stronger, faster, and more advanced. But the first engagement had revealed something important. The Zalthar fought by a rulebook that had calcified over centuries. They expected their enemies to behave in predictable ways. Humanity's best weapon wasn't their railguns or their ships. It was their willingness to do things that made no tactical sense, that violated every rule of proper warfare, that seemed insane to anyone who fought logically. Admiral Krell's armada emerged from faster-than-light travel like a swarm of metal locusts. 200 warships filled the space between Mars and Earth, their hulls gleaming in the distant sunlight. This was 10 times the force that had withdrawn from the first engagement. The Admiral had brought enough firepower to sterilize a planet. He intended to use it. Jake Morrison stood in the command center watching the display as red icons representing enemy ships multiplied across the screen. The tactical computer kept updating the count, each new number making the situation look more hopeless. 200 Imperial ships against 43 human vessels. The math was brutal and simple. Earth couldn't win this fight, but winning wasn't the plan. The plan, developed over countless sleepless nights by Claire and the other tactical officers, was to make victory so expensive that the Empire would reconsider whether Earth was worth the cost. It was a strategy born from desperation, but it was all they had. The human fleet had withdrawn to defensive positions around Earth and the Moon. Every ship was positioned to maximize defensive coverage while maintaining the ability to strike quickly. Claire had studied every battle in human history where a smaller force had held out against overwhelming odds. From the ancient Battle of Thermopylae to the Siege of Stalingrad, certain patterns emerged. Defenders who were willing to sacrifice everything could make attackers pay a terrible price. Intelligence officer Lisa Morgan had spent the past week analyzing the first battle's recordings. She noticed something interesting about how the Imperial ships fought. They maintained strict formations. They communicated using standard encrypted channels. They followed tactical procedures that were obviously drilled into them through years of training. The Zalthar military was professional, disciplined, and predictable. Lisa had proposed a strategy that made everyone uncomfortable. She suggested that humanity abandon every principle of proper military conduct. No formations, no standard communications, no predictable tactics. Instead, every ship would act independently, choosing targets and maneuvers based on immediate opportunities. Pilots would be authorized to ram enemy vessels if no other option existed. Ships too damaged to fight would self-destruct near enemy formations. Every weapon, every tactic, no matter how desperate or insane, would be acceptable. Admiral Krell gave the order to advance. His fleet moved forward in perfect formation, a wall of military might that had conquered dozens of worlds. The Admiral expected the human fleet to either flee to the far side of Earth or emerge to meet him in open battle. Instead, the human ships remained motionless, waiting in their defensive positions. The first wave of Imperial ships approached Earth's orbital space. Claire gave the signal and the human fleet erupted into action. But instead of engaging the Imperial vanguard, human ships fired toward empty space. Hundreds of small objects, each no larger than a car, shot away from human vessels on ballistic trajectories. They were mines, crude explosive devices wrapped in stealth coating. Commander Vexthor watched the strange human behavior with confusion. They were firing at nothing, wasting ammunition. Then his sensors detected the objects as they began spreading throughout the battle space. Mines, thousands of them. The realization came too late for 3 Imperial destroyers that had pushed too far forward. They struck the mines at high velocity and the resulting explosions tore through their hulls. The Imperial fleet slowed its advance. Mine warfare was considered barbaric by galactic standards. It was area denial without honor, a weapon that killed indiscriminately, but it was effective. The Zalthar ships had to slow down to navigate the minefield, and slow ships were easier targets. Pilot Henry Cruz commanded a small attack craft barely larger than an atmospheric fighter. His ship carried only 2 weapons, a single railgun and a nuclear warhead. The nuclear device was meant to be a last resort, a weapon Henry could detonate if his ship was about to be captured. But as he watched the Imperial fleet carefully navigating through the minefield, he had a different idea. He accelerated his tiny craft toward the largest Imperial ship he could see, a massive battlecruiser that dwarfed his vessel. The battlecruiser's defensive weapons locked onto him immediately. Energy beams lashed out, but Henry's small ship was agile enough to dodge most of them. One shot clipped his wing, sending his craft into a spin, but he recovered and continued his approach. The Imperial crew watched the suicidal human pilot with a mixture of respect and horror. Surely the human would break off his attack run. Surely he wouldn't actually crash into a ship millions of times more valuable than his tiny craft. But Henry didn't break off. At the last possible second, he ejected in an escape pod, and his craft, nuclear warhead armed, slammed into the battlecruiser's hull. The explosion was massive. The nuclear device detonated against the ship's shields, overwhelming them through sheer explosive force. The battlecruiser survived, but half its systems were offline. It would require months of repairs. One human pilot in a craft that cost less than the battlecruiser's coffee machine had crippled a ship worth billions. Medical. Officer Greg Palmer worked frantically in the emergency bay of Earth's largest orbital station. Wounded crew members kept arriving faster than he could treat them. A pilot with severe burns, an engineer with explosive decompression injuries, a gunner who had lost an arm when her turret took a direct hit. Greg worked without pause, his hands steady despite the exhaustion. Between patients, Greg listened to radio chatter from the battle. What he heard disturbed him. Human crews weren't retreating even when their ships were crippled. They were staying at their posts, firing until their weapons failed, and then trying to ram enemy vessels. It was brave, heroic even, but it was also insane. These people were choosing certain death over surrender. One transmission stood out. The destroyer Defiant had taken catastrophic damage. Its engines were gone, weapons offline, life support failing. The captain reported that Imperial boarding craft were approaching. The crew could either surrender and be taken prisoner, or they could blow the ship's reactor and take the boarders with them. The captain called for a vote. The crew voted unanimously to blow the reactor. Greg listened to that transmission and felt tears running down his face. The Defiant exploded, taking 2 Imperial boarding craft with it. 23 human lives ended in an instant. But the message was clear. Humanity would rather die than submit. Admiral Krell watched the battle unfold with growing frustration. His fleet was winning. Human ships were being destroyed at a rate of 3-1. But his own losses were far higher than any battle in recent Imperial history. 15 ships destroyed, 40 more damaged. The humans were making every meter of space around their planet cost Imperial blood. The Zalthar crews were becoming unnerved. They had fought many battles, but never against an enemy like this. Every Imperial soldier understood the concept of a tactical retreat, of surrendering when the situation became hopeless. But these humans didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They fought until their ships broke apart around them, and then they kept fighting with whatever they had left. An Imperial cruiser captured a damaged human supply ship. The boarding party expected to find a frightened crew ready to surrender. Instead, they found 12 humans armed with nothing but tools and debris from their shattered ship. The humans attacked with wrenches, metal pipes, and their bare hands. The Imperial soldiers were professional warriors with advanced armor and energy weapons. They won the fight easily, but 3 Imperial soldiers were injured in the struggle. The incident was reported throughout the fleet, and morale began to crack. Supply Officer Nina Torres coordinated the war effort from deep inside a mountain bunker on Earth. Every factory on the planet was running at maximum capacity. Every resource was being converted to weapons, ships, or ammunition. Civilians were volunteering faster than the military could train them. Nina looked at her production reports and realized something terrifying. Earth was mobilizing in a way the Empire never had. The Zalthar Empire conquered through superior technology and military professionalism. They fought wars with their military forces, while their civilian population continued normal life. But humanity had declared total war. Every human, every factory, every resource was dedicated to one goal: survival. The Empire was fighting with 200 ships. Earth was fighting with everything it had. After 6 hours of continuous battle, Admiral Krell made a decision. He ordered his fleet to withdraw to the edge of the solar system and regroup. His forces had destroyed or crippled most of the human fleet. By any measure, it was a victory, but it felt like defeat. He had lost 28 ships destroyed and 60 damaged. For comparison, the Empire's last major war had lasted 3 years and resulted in 30 total ship losses. Jake Morrison watched the Imperial fleet withdraw and collapsed into his chair. Earth's orbital defenses were shattered. The fleet was reduced to 11 functional ships. Thousands of people were dead. But the Empire had been stopped. Again. He didn't know how long this could continue, but for another day, Earth remained free. Claire walked through the ruins of her ship's bridge. The Vigilant had survived barely. Half her crew was dead. The ship itself would never fly again. But they had fought well. She thought about the crews who hadn't survived, about the war ground into its 3rd month like a machine eating both sides alive. Admiral Krell had abandoned the idea of a quick victory. Instead, the Imperial fleet maintained a blockade of Earth's solar system, controlling all the space beyond the asteroid belt. The Empire held overwhelming superiority, but every attempt to push closer to Earth resulted in casualties that made the Admiral's superiors back home question the value of one primitive planet. Pilot Henry Cruz floated in the darkness of an asteroid base, checking his ship for the 5th time that day. The base was hidden deep inside a large asteroid in the belt between Mars and Jupiter. 15 other human pilots lived here with him, along with support crews who kept their ships flying. They had become ghosts, striking at Imperial supply convoys and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Henry's ship was a patchwork of human and salvaged Imperial technology. After his successful ramming attack in the first major battle, he had been rescued by a search team. Now he flew a craft that was barely holding together, armed with whatever weapons the engineers could scavenge. But it flew and it could fight, and that was enough. The asteroid bases were Claire's idea. Instead of concentrating forces where the Empire could destroy them, she had proposed scattering small groups throughout the solar system. Each base operated independently, choosing its own targets and timing. The strategy was based on ancient guerrilla warfare tactics updated for space combat. Hit and run. Never fight a battle you couldn't win. Make the enemy afraid of empty space. Commander Vexthor had grown to hate humanity with a passion that surprised him. His once gleaming warship was scarred from dozens of engagements. Half his original crew was dead or injured. He had personally witnessed acts of human desperation that would haunt him forever. A human pilot ejecting toward an Imperial ship and detonating a bomb strapped to his suit. A damaged human freighter accelerating into an Imperial formation under full thrust. Crew members singing as their life support failed. What disturbed Vexthor most was that he was beginning to understand these creatures. The Empire conquered through demonstration of superior force. show that resistance was futile, and rational beings would surrender to preserve their lives and civilization. But humans didn't think that way. They seemed to believe that some things were worth more than life itself. Freedom, independence, the right to determine their own future. To Vexthor's ordered military mind, this made no sense. Dead people had no freedom. Destroyed civilizations had no future. Yet the humans kept fighting. Every setback made them more determined. Every loss strengthened their resolve. It was the opposite of how conquered species were supposed to behave. Vexthor had read the Imperial handbooks on occupation and resistance. All of them assumed that casualties would eventually break an enemy's will to fight. None of them explained what to do when casualties made the enemy angrier. Imperial supply lines stretched across dozens of star systems, feeding the massive fleet blockading Earth. Henry and his fellow pilots made those supply lines bleed. A convoy of fuel tankers would be traveling through the asteroid belt, protected by 3 destroyers. The convoy would seem safe until 15 human ships appeared from the asteroids, fired everything they had, and vanished back into the rocks before the destroyers could respond. The attacks rarely destroyed their targets completely, but they forced the Empire to dedicate more and more ships to escort duty. Every ship guarding a convoy was a ship that couldn't be used to attack Earth. Henry was fighting a war of attrition, and the math was slowly shifting. The Empire had more ships, but they were scattered across their entire territory. Earth had fewer ships, but they were all here, focused on one desperate goal. On Earth itself, Supply Officer Nina Torres worked miracles of production. The planet's entire economy had been converted to war production. Factories that once made cars now made missiles. Shipyards built military vessels around the clock. Scientists who had studied medicine or physics were now designing weapons. Nina coordinated all of it, pushing production higher every week despite dwindling resources. She knew the numbers better than anyone. Earth was running out of everything. Raw materials, fuel, food, trained personnel. The planet could maintain current production levels for maybe 6 more months. After that, the war effort would collapse from lack of resources. Nina kept these projections to herself. Her job was to keep the factories running, not to spread despair. But she knew the truth. Humanity was losing a race against time. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. Intelligence Officer Lisa Morgan had been monitoring Imperial communications for months, learning the patterns of their encrypted signals. She couldn't break the encryption, but she could map their network. She noticed something interesting. One ship was the center of all communications. Every order, every report, every strategic decision flowed through one massive vessel at the edge of the solar system. Lisa brought her findings to Jake and Claire during one of their rare planning sessions. She explained that the vessel was almost certainly Admiral Krell's command carrier. If they could damage or destroy that ship, they might decapitate the Imperial fleet's command structure. At minimum, it would cause chaos and confusion. At best, it might force a withdrawal while the Empire reorganized. Jake studied the tactical display showing the command carrier's position. It was surrounded by 30 defensive ships in a perfect sphere formation. The carrier itself was twice the size of any other vessel in the system. Its shields and armor were designed to withstand sustained assault from an entire fleet. Attacking it would require punching through 30 ships and then somehow damaging a vessel built to be nearly indestructible. Claire was already sketching out an attack plan before Jake finished examining the data. She proposed using every human ship still capable of fighting. They would come from different directions simultaneously, forcing the defenders to split their attention. Some ships would carry nuclear weapons to break through the defensive screen. Others would focus on overwhelming the carrier's shields. And one ship, loaded with every explosive they could fit inside it, would try to ram the carrier's bridge. It was suicide. Everyone in the room knew it. The plan required perfect timing, absolute commitment, and incredible luck. Even if everything went right, maybe 1 in 10 attackers would survive. If anything went wrong, they would all die and accomplish nothing. Jake looked around the room at his officers and saw no hesitation in their eyes. They were ready. The attack was scheduled for 3 days later. Every human ship in the solar system received orders to converge on the rally point. Henry Cruz read his orders and smiled grimly. A suicide mission. Finally, something that made sense. He made sure his ship was armed and fueled, then recorded a message for his sister back on Earth. He told her he loved her, that he was proud to fight for their world, and that she should name her first child after him. 30 human ships gathered in the shadow of Saturn's rings. It was the largest force humanity had assembled since the war began. Mechanics worked frantically to get every ship battle ready. Pilots reviewed the attack plan one last time. Medical Officer Greg Palmer moved between ships, checking on crews and offering what comfort he could. He knew most of these people would be dead in a few hours. Jake Morrison would lead the attack personally. Claire tried to argue that the commander should stay safe and direct the battle from Earth, but Jake refused. He wouldn't order people to die while he watched from safety. If humanity was going to make one last desperate gamble, their leader needed to be at the front. Claire stopped arguing and instead requested permission to fly beside him. Permission granted. The night before the attack, the crews gathered for a final meeting. There were no speeches about glory or victory. Jake simply explained the plan one more time and reminded everyone why they were fighting. Not for land or resources or pride, but for the simple right to live free. The meeting ended with a moment of silence for all those already lost. Some crews played music. Others wrote letters to loved ones. A few prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Henry Cruz spent the time in his cockpit, watching the stars and thinking about Earth. He had grown up in California, spent summers at the beach, loved a girl who died in the first Imperial attack on Earth's orbital stations. He was fighting for a world he might never see again, for a future he probably wouldn't survive to enjoy. Admiral Krell sat in his command chair, reviewing supply reports and casualty projections. The war was becoming unsustainable. His superiors wanted results. The civilian government back on the Zalthar homeworld was questioning whether Earth was worth the cost. 30 ships lost, hundreds damaged, thousands of soldiers dead, all to conquer one backward planet. The Admiral knew his career was at stake. One more failure and he would be replaced. His sensors detected nothing unusual. The human fleet had been quiet for weeks, their attacks diminishing as their resources ran low. Krell assumed they were finally broken, finally ready to surrender. He was composing a message offering generous peace terms when the alarm sounded. 30 human ships had just appeared on his sensors, accelerating toward his position from multiple directions. The final battle was beginning, and Admiral Krell had no idea how close he was to learning the hardest lesson of his career. The human fleet burst from the darkness like a swarm of angry wasps. 30 ships, all that remained of Earth's once proud defense force, accelerated toward Admiral Krell's command carrier from 6 different vectors. Jake Morrison led the central attack group, his ship's engines burning at maximum thrust. Beside him flew Claire Bennett, and behind them came 8 more vessels loaded with nuclear weapons and determination. The Imperial defensive fleet reacted instantly. 30 warships moved to intercept, their weapon systems lighting up the void with energy fire. But the Zalthar defenders faced an impossible problem. 6 simultaneous attacks from different directions meant they had to split their forces. Basic mathematics worked against them. 5 ships moved to block each human attack group, leaving the command carrier protected by perfect coordination rather than overwhelming numbers. Henry Cruz came in low, relatively speaking, his attack vector taking him under the plane of battle. His group consisted of the smallest and fastest ships, little more than missiles with pilots. Their job was to draw fire and create chaos. Henry pushed his craft through a corkscrew pattern as energy beams tried to track him. One shot clipped his shield and warning lights flashed across his console. He ignored them and fired his railgun at the nearest Imperial destroyer. Communications Officer Beth Cooper sat at her station aboard Jake's ship, broadcasting on all channels. She transmitted a message that the entire galaxy would hear, a declaration that humanity wanted recorded for history. The message was simple. Humanity would never kneel, never surrender, never accept subjugation. If the Empire wanted Earth, they would have to destroy it completely, and even then, somewhere in the stars, humans would survive to remember and resist. The words echoed across Imperial communication networks. Zalthar officers heard them and felt something they rarely experienced: doubt. These humans meant what they said. This wasn't bravado or psychological warfare. They were stating simple fact. Commander Vexthor, leading one of the defensive groups, listened to Beth's transmission and felt a chill run through his body. These creatures really would rather die than submit. It wasn't a negotiating tactic. It was who they were. The first nuclear detonation lit up space like a tiny sun. A human ship too damaged to continue had accelerated directly into an Imperial cruiser and triggered its warhead. The explosion overwhelmed shields through sheer brute force. The cruiser and the human ship vanished in a bloom of nuclear fire. The other Imperial defenders hesitated for just a moment, horrified by the suicidal tactic. That moment of hesitation was all Claire needed. She led her group through the gap in the defensive formation, racing toward the command carrier. 5 Imperial ships moved to intercept, firing continuously. Claire's wingman took a direct hit and exploded. Another human ship lost its engines and spiraled away. But Claire kept flying, kept dodging, kept pushing forward with 3 ships still following her. Admiral Krell watched the battle unfold with growing alarm. These humans were attacking with no regard for their own survival. Half their force was already destroyed, but the survivors were still coming. He ordered his defensive fleet to tighten formation, to create an impenetrable wall between the humans and his carrier. But the humans had no intention of being stopped by walls. Jake Morrison armed every weapon his ship carried. Nuclear missiles, railgun rounds, even the small defensive lasers meant for shooting down incoming fire. His shields were failing. His hull was breached in 3 places and his engine output was dropping. None of it mattered. The command carrier was ahead of him, massive and seemingly invincible. He just needed to get close enough. An Imperial battleship moved to block Jake's path. The battleship was 5 times larger than Jake's destroyer, its weapons capable of vaporizing his ship with a single sustained burst. But Jake didn't try to fight it. Instead, he flew straight at it, forcing the battleship to choose, maintain position and be rammed, or move aside and let him pass. The battleship moved. In that moment, Jake understood something profound. The Empire valued their ships more than humans valued theirs. Henry Cruz's group had completed their diversionary attack and swung around for another pass. Only 3 of his ships remained. Henry saw Jake's group approaching the command carrier and made a split-second decision. He ordered his remaining pilots to follow him in a desperate charge directly into the densest concentration of Imperial ships. They would draw fire, create chaos, give Jake a few more precious seconds. The gambit worked. 5 Imperial ships turned to engage Henry's charging vessels. Energy beams crisscrossed space. Henry's shields failed completely and his hull began taking direct hits. Warning alarms screamed in his ears. He kept flying. He managed to fire one last railgun shot at an Imperial destroyer before a plasma beam sliced his ship in half. His last thought was that he hoped it was enough. Claire's group reached the command carrier. 2 ships remained with her. The carrier's point defense systems opened fire, filling space with defensive lasers and energy pulses. One of Claire's wingmen exploded instantly. The other pressed forward, shields blazing with absorbed energy, firing nuclear missiles as fast as they could launch. The missiles detonated against the carrier's shields in a rippling series of explosions. Jake saw the shields flicker. Just for a moment, the incredible energies battering them caused a localized failure. It was a gap measured in microseconds, a window that would close almost before it opened. Jake fired everything his ship had left. Railgun rounds, missiles, lasers, all targeted at the exact point where the shields had flickered. Some rounds were absorbed when the shields recovered, but a few got through. The command carrier shuddered as solid projectiles punched through its outer hull. The damage was superficial compared to the ship's massive size, but it was damage. An invincible vessel had been hurt. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating. The Imperial crews had believed their command ship was untouchable. Now they knew it could be harmed. Jake's ship was dying. Systems failed across all decks. His engines were losing power. Life support was offline. He had maybe 30 seconds before the ship broke apart completely. He could eject, trigger his escape pod, and hope to be rescued. Or he could make those 30 seconds count. Jake armed his ship's self-destruct sequence, locked his course directly toward the command carrier's bridge, and tied down his controls. Then he ran. Jake sprinted through his collapsing ship toward the escape pod bay. Behind him, bulkheads collapsed and atmosphere vented. He dove into the nearest pod, slammed the hatch, and ejected just as his ship disintegrated. Through the pod's small window, he watched his destroyer, or what remained of it, continue forward on momentum. The ship's reactor, set to overload, slammed into the command carrier's bridge section and exploded. Admiral Krell was thrown from his command chair as the explosion rocked his ship. Lights failed. Gravity generators went offline. Through the chaos, he heard damage reports flooding in. The bridge was destroyed. Primary systems were offline. His mighty command carrier was crippled, helpless in space, relying on auxiliary power just to maintain life support. Commander Vexthor watched the command carrier drift, dark and silent. The human attack had cost them everything. All 30 human ships were destroyed or disabled. But they had achieved their objective. The Imperial fleet's command structure was decapitated. Vexthor found himself in command of a fleet that suddenly had no clear orders, no strategic direction, just scattered ships and mounting casualties. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Vexthor transmitted a ceasefire order to all Imperial vessels. Then he opened a channel to Earth and requested negotiations. The war was over, not because the Empire had been defeated militarily, but because Vexthor finally understood that victory was impossible. You cannot conquer people who refuse to be conquered. You cannot break an enemy willing to destroy themselves to hurt you. The Empire could kill every human in existence, but they could never make humanity surrender. Back on Earth, Jake's escape pod was recovered by a human search team. He was alive, barely, floating in a tiny pod light years from home. Claire's pod was recovered too. She had ejected seconds before her ship exploded. Of the 30 ships that attacked the command carrier, 4 pilots survived. 26 ships and their crews were gone, but Earth was still free. Supply Officer Nina Torres received the ceasefire notification and collapsed into her chair. She had been working for 72 hours straight, coordinating the construction of ships that would never be needed now. The factories fell silent for the first time in 3 months. Workers emerged from underground bunkers and looked at the sky, wondering if it was really over. Medical Officer Greg Palmer worked through the night treating the wounded from the final battle. His hands moved automatically, guided by months of constant practice. Each life he saved felt like a small victory against the darkness. By dawn, the last patient was stabilized, and Greg finally allowed himself to rest. The war was over. Humanity had survived. Commander Vexthor prepared for the peace negotiations with mixed feelings. The Empire had lost this war in every way that mattered. They had lost ships, soldiers, and most importantly, their reputation for invincibility. Other species would hear about humanity and wonder if they too could resist. The peace talks were held aboard a neutral station constructed hastily in the space between Earth and Mars. The station was little more than a pressurized cylinder with docking ports, but it was neutral ground where neither side had advantage. Commander Vexthor arrived first, his shuttle escorted by a token guard of 2 Imperial destroyers. He waited in the bare conference room, reflecting on how much had changed in 3 months. Captain Jake Morrison entered the room wearing a fresh uniform that barely concealed the injuries from his escape pod crash. His left arm was in a regenerative cast, and he walked with a slight limp. Behind him came Claire Bennett, looking tired but alert, and several other human officers. The 2 groups sat across from each other at a simple metal table, enemies meeting as near equals for the first time. Vexthor spoke first, his translator converting his words into human language. He acknowledged that the Empire had underestimated humanity. It was a difficult admission for someone raised in a culture that valued strength above all else. He explained that the Empire was prepared to offer terms, but he wanted to understand something first. Why did humans fight so desperately? The Zalthar had offered survival. Humans had chosen death instead. What made freedom worth that price? Jake considered the question carefully. He explained that humanity had a long history of people fighting for freedom against impossible odds. Slaves who rebelled knowing they would die, colonists who defied empires, protesters who stood against tanks. Freedom wasn't just about survival. It was about dignity, self-determination, the right to make your own choices and live with the consequences. A life in chains might be life, but it wasn't living. Claire added that humanity had learned something during the war. They learned what they were capable of when pushed to the edge. Earth had always been divided, hundreds of nations competing and fighting. But when faced with external threat, they had united completely. Every human on Earth and in the colonies had contributed to the war effort. They had discovered an identity larger than their individual nations. They were human, and no one would take that from them. Vexthor listened and slowly nodded. He was beginning to understand. The Empire conquered species who valued survival above all else. They offered continued existence under Imperial rule, and most species accepted because the alternative was extinction. But humans valued something more than survival. They valued the right to be human, whatever that meant to them. Take that away, and you gave them nothing worth preserving. The commander presented the Empire's terms. Earth would be recognized as an independent sovereign world. The blockade would end immediately. Imperial forces would withdraw from human space. In exchange, Earth would agree not to expand militarily beyond its current solar system for 10 standard years. Trade agreements could be negotiated separately. There would be reparations, though Vexthor admitted quietly that determining who owed what would be complicated. Engineer Danny Wells had joined the negotiations specifically to discuss technology exchange. He proposed that instead of reparations, both sides should share certain technologies. Earth would benefit from Imperial advances in medicine, energy generation, and space travel. The Empire would gain access to human creativity in weapons design and tactical thinking. Danny pointed out that humanity's railgun technology, primitive as it was, had proven effective against shields designed to stop energy weapons. Other species in the galaxy might find that information valuable. The proposal surprised Vexthor. Most conquered species begged for technology but offered nothing in return. But humans were proposing a trade, an exchange between equals. It was presumptuous, almost insulting. Yet Vexthor found himself considering it seriously. Human weapons had hurt Imperial ships. Human tactics had surprised seasoned commanders. Perhaps there was value in what these primitives had developed. Supply Officer Nina Torres raised a practical concern. Earth's economy was destroyed. The planet had converted everything to war production, leaving civilian industry in ruins. Millions of people faced starvation in the coming months. The planet needed food shipments, medical supplies, and reconstruction materials. She asked bluntly if the Empire would help rebuild what they had tried to destroy. Vexthor was surprised by the question. In Imperial conquest, the defeated paid tribute to the victors. Nina was asking the Empire to pay tribute to Earth. It was backwards, illogical. Yet as Vexthor looked around the table at these scarred, exhausted humans who had fought his empire to a standstill, he realized they had earned the right to ask. He agreed to humanitarian aid shipments beginning immediately. The negotiations continued for 3 days. Every detail had to be worked out carefully, translated precisely, agreed upon by both sides. Intelligence Officer Lisa Morgan proved invaluable, having learned enough about Zalthar culture to avoid misunderstandings. She explained to the humans that Zalthar placed enormous importance on formal hierarchy and honor. The peace treaty needed to allow both sides to claim victory in some way, or it would never last. The final treaty was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise. It recognized Earth as an independent sovereign world with rights and responsibilities equal to any other galactic civilization. The Empire acknowledged that humanity had defended itself successfully, which in Zalthar culture meant they had earned the right to independence. Earth acknowledged the Empire's military superiority, but claimed victory by maintaining their freedom. Both sides could honestly say they won. Medical Officer Greg Palmer stood in the station's observation deck, watching as the Imperial fleet began its withdrawal. Hundreds of ships that had been enemy forces for months were slowly moving away from Earth. The blockade that had strangled humanity's solar system was ending. Greg had spent years studying medicine to save lives, never imagining he would spend months treating war casualties. He was grateful it was over, but he knew the scars would take years to heal. Pilot Henry Cruz was posthumously awarded Earth's highest military honor for his actions during the final battle. His sister accepted the medal on his behalf during a ceremony attended by thousands. Jake Morrison gave the speech, describing Henry's courage and sacrifice. But he also talked about all the people who would never receive medals, who died in anonymous battles throughout the solar system, who gave everything for a future they would never see. The withdrawal took 2 weeks. Imperial ships departed slowly, maintaining defensive formations until they were safely clear of human space. Vexthor stayed until the end, supervising the evacuation personally. On the last day, he met with Jake one final time. The two officers who had been enemies shared a drink, a human custom that Vexthor found oddly appealing. Jake asked what Vexthor would tell the Empire about humanity. The commander thought about it for a long moment. He would tell them the truth, that humans were dangerous not because of their technology or numbers, but because they were unpredictable. They valued things that couldn't be calculated or measured. They made decisions that seemed irrational but achieved impossible results. Any species that could fight the way humans fought deserved respect and caution. Bexthor had his own question. What would humans do now? They had earned their freedom through blood and sacrifice. But the galaxy was a dangerous place, full of species and empires far more powerful than Earth. How would humanity survive in a cosmos that didn't care about bravery or determination? Jake smiled and said humanity would do what they always did. They would adapt, learn, and grow. They would make mistakes and recover from them. They would meet other species and sometimes fight, sometimes trade, sometimes become friends. But whatever happened, Earth would face it as free people making their own choices. That was all they had ever wanted. The last Imperial ship departed human space 6 months after first contact. Earth was left alone, scarred and damaged but undefeated. The orbital shipyards began constructing new vessels, not weapons of war but exploration ships. Nina Torres coordinated the reconstruction effort, converting factories back to civilian production. Greg Palmer helped establish medical clinics to treat the psychological trauma that afflicted thousands of survivors. Claire Bennett was promoted to admiral and given command of Earth's defense forces. She instituted new training programs based on lessons learned during the war. Human military doctrine changed completely, embracing the unconventional tactics that had proven so effective. Other species began approaching Earth, curious about the civilization that had fought the Zalthar Empire to a standstill. Engineer Danny Wells led a team working with captured and traded Imperial technology. Within a year, Earth had developed faster-than-light travel. The first human ship to leave the solar system was named Indomitable, a word that meant unconquerable and unbreakable. It was crewed by volunteers ready to explore the galaxy and represent humanity among the stars. The story of humanity's war with the Empire spread throughout the galaxy. Other species heard how a primitive civilization had refused to surrender, had fought with courage that bordered on insanity, had made victory so costly that the Empire chose peace. Some species saw humans as inspiration. Others saw them as dangerous. Everyone learned to take humanity seriously. Jake Morrison retired from active duty but stayed involved as an advisor. He spent his time writing a complete history of the war,